Well, CBS News contributor Bob Schieffer covered George Bush's presidential campaigns in 1980 and 1988, and longtime Face the Nation moderator joins us now from Washington, along with USA Today Washington bureau chief Susan Page, who also covered both both campaigns for President Bush. And you also have an upcoming book. It's called The Matriarch, Barbara Bush and the Making of an American Dynasty. So happy to have both of you here. Bob, I want to start with you. You've covered 11 presidencies and say that President George H.W. Bush was the most modest man to ever hold office. I remember reading that humility was something that he learned from his mother, that she it was something that she impressed upon him to remain humble. How do you think that impacted his presidency, though?
I think that's the reason we'll probably remember him as a better public servant than as a politician. He just didn't like promoting his own cause, and it was very difficult for him, as remarkable as that seems in this day and time. He was very restrained about that, and as a result, it was difficult for him when he got out on the campaign trail, or just in talking about things that he was trying to do and trying to accomplish. But he was a remarkable public service because in his family, loyalty, public service, those were the things that really came first. And I think in the end, that's why we'll remember the things that he did manage to accomplish.
Susan, President Bush certainly had a way with words. He certainly had a tremendous sense of humor. But I think you really saw how much he loved his family when he wrote notes. He wrote love letters to his wife. He wrote love letters to his sons. He was a prolific writer, even though he didn't actually write an autobiography himself. So much of who he was you could find in his notes and letters, and you actually received one of those notes.
Yes, I did. And I would just say, in some ways, he was inartful when he had to speak, but he was a beautiful writer when he put pen to paper. And here's what happened in 1990 at a White House news conference. He called on me. He kept calling me Ann. I think he was confusing me with Ann Devroy, who was then the White House correspondent for the Washington Post. And this was causing a little humorous reaction in the press corps, that my colleagues around me, because every time he called me Ann, they would laugh a little louder. When he left the news conference, he turned to his press secretary, Marlon Fitzwater, and said, "Why were they laughing at me?" And he said, "Well, her name is Susan." So the next day, I got this very nice handwritten, and of course, I took no offense. Believe me, he had bigger things on his mind than my name. The next day, I got this lovely handwritten note from him that said, I know your name is Nan, but I forgot that Anne Margaret lives on the West Coast, which was a funny, corny, Bush-like joke that was just so endearing.
Indeed. This thing about his notes and letters, Bob, I remember his son reading a letter that he had written to him once, and I was so moved by the fact that here was a man that was so incredibly busy, but he took the time out to write this really touching note. You could tell that he chose his words with precision to express his love for his son, that it started me writing notes for my daughter. My daughter's very young. She's only 7, but I figured these are notes that she will hopefully be reading for the rest of her life, much in the same way George W. Bush continued to read the notes and letters he got from his father. And I wondered if you ever talked to the two men about their shared experience of both being president of the United States and, what that did for their bond.
I did. In 2014, George W. Bush wrote a book called 41. He said in the beginning, "This is not objective. This is about somebody I love," and it's a tribute. And it was really a lovely book. And I want to tell you, the love that George H.W. Bush had for his children was reciprocal. They loved him back. He was so modest, he wouldn't even write a book about his experiences in the White House, which is almost hard to believe in this day and time. But he always said the legacy he was proud of was that his kids still came home to see him. He also said, by the way, that his greatest achievement was not in foreign policy or not in government, but in marrying Barbara Bush. And of course, they were married for 74 years.
Yeah. Speaking of that, another great love of President Bush. You wrote a book about Barbara Bush. We talked about it at the beginning of this interview, and you spoke to the president for that book. It ended up being one of his last interviews. What was that like?
Yes, this turned out to be the last interview that George H.W. Bush did with a journalist. It was almost exactly a year ago in November of 2017. He wasn't doing many interviews, but I think he was willing to do the interview because it wasn't about himself. It was about his beloved wife. And we talked about the difference. He talked about a couple of things. One of the things he noted was how remarkable it was that Barbara Pierce, who had grown up in Rye, New York, was willing to pick up and leave with her new husband and their little baby, Georgie, and move to Odessa, Texas, which might have been as well have been Odessa on the Black Sea. It seemed like such a foreign land from where she had grown up in New England. And that her willingness to do that was one of the things that he was grateful for all these years later. You know, at the point I interviewed him, I think they'd been married for 73 years. He was still remembering that willingness to follow him. And he also talked about the first time. I said, do you remember the first time you saw Barbara Pierce? And he said, yes, it was at this Christmas dance at the Greenwich Country Club when they were both in high school. I said, what caught your eye? And he said, she was so beautiful.
Oh, my goodness. And I recall her saying that he was the most handsome man that she had ever seen. Yeah, that definitely was a love for the ages. Bob, I want to read a portion of Bill Clinton's op-ed that he wrote in the Washington Post. And he said, I cherished every opportunity I had to learn and love with him. I just loved him. He was in it for the right reasons. People always came before politics, patriotism before partisanship. You know, some could argue that his sense of bipartisanship perhaps is the reason he was a single-term president. You know, his willingness to, well, you know, he went back on a campaign promise, his willingness to raise taxes in exchange for a deal that he had with the Democrats that spending would be cut, and it backfired for him. You know, what were some of his mistakes, would you say, as president?
Well, I don't think that was a mistake, even though it cost him the election, and I don't think there's any question about that, because that had been the mantra throughout his campaign: read my lips, no new taxes. And then toward the end of his term, the deficit was just ballooning out of sight. He had no choice, and his advisors warned him that you're going back on your word if you raise taxes. But he did raise taxes, and the economy did get a whole lot better. He resolved the problem, but a lot of people on the right never forgave him that, and it cost him the election. I would also add that later on, the Kennedy Library gave him its Profile in Courage Award for doing that. But that was a long time after he had lost that election. But I don't think he ever thought back. He knew what needed to be done, and he was willing to do it, and he paid a price for it.
He certainly did, but a valuable lesson for all those in politics now. Bob and Susan, thank you so much.